Just sign it, Margot. Stop dragging this out. Colin shoved the papers across the kitchen island, the one we'd picked out together at a showroom in Westchester 12 years ago, back when he still opened doors for me and called me his whole world. Now his voice had the flat, irritated tone people use with a slow waiter. Beside him stood Brooke, 26 years old, her hand resting on a belly that strained against a silk maternity dress I was fairly sure cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She looked down at me with the particular smile of a woman who has already won and wants you to watch her enjoy it. "You're sure about this?" I said. It wasn't really a question. My voice came out steady, which surprised even me, because inside my chest there was nothing but a flat, gray stillness, like a lake that had frozen straight through to the bottom. "Of course I'm sure." Colin laughed, short and ugly. "I'm going to be happy with Brooke and our baby. Did you really think I was going to spend the rest of my life with someone as boring as you? You stopped trying years ago." His mother, Margaret, nodded from the doorway with the satisfaction of a woman watching a verdict she'd been waiting years to hear. "My son deserves a wife who can actually give this family an heir. A woman who's spent 15 years doing nothing useful doesn't get to stand here and act wounded. Get your things and get out, Margot, and don't you dare come back and embarrass this family." Margaret's eyes swept over me the way you'd look at a stain on a carpet you were finally allowed to throw out. I looked down at the papers. Colin's signature. Brooke's. Absurdly, as if she had any legal standing to witness anything. Margaret's signature under witness, her handwriting as sharp and self-satisfied as her voice. All that was left was mine. "All right," I said. I picked up the pen. I didn't hesitate, because the truth is, hesitation had left me months earlier, somewhere between the third time I found lipstick on his collar and the night his phone lit up on the nightstand with a message that ended my marriage before I ever said a word about it. I signed my name, Margot Ashford, the name I'd worn like a costume for 15 years, and I felt my daughter's small hand tighten around the hem of my sleeve. Nora was 6. She had been standing so quietly by the pantry door that I think Colin and Margaret had genuinely forgotten she was in the room, which tells you everything you need to know about how much space my daughter had been allowed to take up in that house. Good. Finally. Colin snatched the papers up like a man closing a business deal he'd been waiting on for months, which, in a way, he was. "Pack your things and go. Tonight, if you can manage it." "My bags are already packed," I said, standing. For 1/2 of a second, something flickered across his face. Not regret. Something closer to confusion, the look of a man who has thrown a punch expecting resistance, and instead found only air. He recovered fast. "Come on, Nora." I took my daughter's hand and walked toward the front door without looking back at the house I had spent 15 years cleaning, decorating, defending, and slowly disappearing inside of. What none of them knew, what Colin, Margaret, and Brooke could not have possibly imagined as they stood in that kitchen congratulating themselves, was that within 3 hours I would be boarding a flight out of the country with my daughter asleep against my shoulder. They didn't know that the new life they were toasting to that night was going to become the very blade that cut their old one to ribbons. They had no idea that the fresh start they thought they'd finally won for themselves would, in a matter of months, drag every one of them down into a version of hell they hadn't known existed. Rain streaked the taxi window on the way to the airport, blurring the city lights into long gold smears. Nora had cried herself out somewhere over the Triborough Bridge and was now asleep against my arm, her small mouth slightly open, a stuffed rabbit crushed under one fist. I watched the city slide past, the city I'd lived in my entire adult life, and let myself, for the first time in months, actually think about what 15 years had cost me. I had married Colin Ashford at 23. He'd been handsome in the specific way that ambitious, mediocre men often are. Good suits, a confident handshake, A way of talking about the future that made you believe he had a plan for both of you. "When we're married, I want you home," he'd told me over dinner 2 weeks before our wedding, holding my hand across the table like it was a gift he was giving me instead of a door he was closing. A real partnership. You taking care of things at home, me building our future at work. I gave up a career I'd spent 4 years building. I told myself it was a partnership. Margaret's wedding toast should have told me everything. "Well," she'd said, lifting her champagne with a smile that didn't touch her eyes, "I suppose a girl with no particular skills is at least good for keeping a house. You'll be living comfortably off my son's income, so I trust you'll know how to be grateful." 15 years of gratitude. 15 years of, "Is dinner ready?" and "You didn't iron this collar right," and "Why does the house smell like that?" delivered in the exact tone you'd use on a housekeeper who was underperforming. Colin was charming to everyone who wasn't me, warm at parties, generous with waiters, beloved by his colleagues. At home, he was a different animal entirely, and I had spent a decade and a half learning exactly which sounds preceded which moods, learning to have dinner on the table 4 minutes before he walked in the door, learning to disappear into the wallpaper when his temper needed somewhere else to land. I told myself Nora was worth it. I told myself that every time Margaret criticized my cooking in front of guests, every time Colin came home late smelling like someone else's perfume and called it work drinks, every time I swallowed something that should have been said out loud. "I have to be strong for this child," I would tell myself in the bathroom mirror at midnight, my face pale under the fluorescent light. "I can survive this." And then, 6 months ago, everything cracked open. Colin started staying out later, his weekends filled up with client golf that never seemed to produce any actual clients. There was a new cologne on his jacket that wasn't his, and then there was lipstick on a collar he swore he'd never worn out of the house. I wasn't naive. I knew the signs. I had simply run out of energy to fight them. The final blow came on an ordinary Tuesday night. His phone buzzed on the nightstand while he was in the shower, and a name lit up the screen with a small red heart beside it. Brooke. Under it, a message. "Miss you tonight. The baby wants to see his daddy too." I remember the specific physical sensation of the floor tilting beneath me. Not just an affair, a pregnancy. 15 years, and he'd started a whole new family before he'd even ended this one. When I confronted him, there was no guilt in his face. Only a kind of relief. Like a man setting down a bag he'd been carrying too long. "Oh, so you found out," he said, almost amused. "Good timing, actually. I've been meaning to tell you. I'm marrying Brooke. We're getting a divorce." "We're married," I said, my voice cracking despite myself. "We have a daughter." "So what? Brooke's carrying my kid. There's no point pretending with someone I don't even see as a woman anymore." He said it so casually, like he was commenting on traffic. 15 years, erased in one sentence. I went to Margaret, some last desperate reflex hoping a mother might intervene for her son's marriage, if not for me. She only smiled, cold and pleased. "Well, Colin's finally getting a proper wife. Young, pretty, and if we're lucky, she'll actually give this family a grandson this time." Margaret had never forgiven me for having a daughter. Brooke's pregnancy was simply the excuse she'd been waiting for. After that, the house became something closer to a prison. Colin cut off my access to our joint accounts within days. He started bringing Brooke to the house openly, and I would watch him rest his hand on her stomach in front of our daughter and feel something inside me break a little further each time. "Mommy, don't cry," Nora told me one night, wiping my face with her small hand, an act of comfort no 6-year-old should ever have to learn. That was the night I decided. If I stayed, I would watch my daughter grow up believing this was what love looked like. Silence, humiliation, a woman shrinking herself down to fit into whatever space was left over. I would not let that happen. I began planning my exit in total secrecy, moving pieces into place so quietly that not even Colin's mother, who monitored my every move like a warden, ever noticed. The taxi pulled up to the departures curb. The rain had finally stopped, and a handful of stars had broken through the clouds. "We're here, sweetheart," I whispered, waking Nora gently. "Let's go." We pulled our suitcase through the sliding doors together. A new life was about to begin for the two of us, and though none of them knew it yet, a very different kind of new life was about to begin for the family I was leaving behind, one that would look nothing like the celebration they were currently enjoying. I glanced back one last time at the skyline behind us, glowing orange against the clouds. I would not be coming back to this city as the woman who left it. Then my phone buzzed. An unknown number. Something about the hour made my stomach drop before I even answered. "Hello?" The voice on the other end wasn't Colin's, or Margaret's. It was Colin's father, Richard, and I hadn't heard him sound this shaken in years. "Margot, I'm so sorry." Richard's voice was strained, older sounding than I remembered. It had been months since I'd heard him say more than a handful of words at a dinner table. Unlike Margaret, Richard had always been a quiet man who let his wife run the family the way she ran everything else, with an iron grip and a sharp tongue. When Colin had announced the divorce, Richard had simply watched from the corner of the room and said nothing. "Richard, it's late. What is it?" "Colin told me you left. Said you signed the papers and walked out." There was an accusation buried in his tone, as if I were the one who'd broken something. "Yes. He's marrying Brooke. She's pregnant, isn't she?" A heavy exhale on the other end. "Yes. About that. Margot, are you sure this is really the smart move? What about Nora? Do you honestly think you can raise her by yourself? Colin isn't going to pay a cent in support, you know that." I felt my jaw tighten. Colin knew exactly what he was doing, cutting me off financially, certain I had nothing behind me but a stay-at-home resume and an empty savings account. What he didn't know was that I'd spent 15 years quietly building something he never once thought to ask about. "I'll be fine," I said. "I have a plan. I'm going to raise my daughter to be an incredible person, with or without him." "Don't be so stubborn." Richard's voice sharpened. "What exactly can you do? If you go back tonight, apologize, beg a little, maybe he'll break it off with that girl. For Nora's sake, isn't that the smarter path?" "Richard, I am never going to beg Colin for anything." He held that woman's stomach in front of our daughter. "I don't want a man like that anywhere near how she grows up." "Don't be so proud," Richard actually shouted then, a rare crack in the composure he'd worn like armor for 30 years. "A woman with no skills can't raise a child alone, Margot. Even Margaret says you have no charm left. That's why he's leaving you. Now listen to me. Come home by tomorrow. I'll talk to Colin myself. We'll pay that girl off and send her away. You just need to stay quiet and remain his wife." It was meant to sound like a lifeline. It was actually a plan to protect the family's reputation, nothing more, to paper over the crack rather than admit the whole foundation was rotten. "It's too late, Richard. I've already made my decision." "Decision? What decision?" "I will never have anything to do with Colin again. And this is goodbye to your family, too." I hung up before he could answer, my hand trembling around the phone. "Mommy? Who is that?" Nora, half awake, looked up at me with worried eyes. "Nobody important, sweetheart. We're going to get on a plane soon." "A plane? Where are we going?" "Somewhere far away," I said, smoothing her hair. "A happy place, just for the two of us." I was terrified. I had no real certainty about what waited for us on the other side of the ocean, but there was no version of turning back that I could live with. "Nora, I'm sorry we had to leave Daddy," I whispered, a moment of weakness slipping out before I could stop it. She shook her small head. I don't need Daddy. He was always mad at you, and Grandma was always mean to you. I don't want to see you cry anymore, Mommy. I stared at my daughter, stunned. She had understood more about the poison in that house than I had ever given her credit for. I pulled her into a hug so tight she squeaked. Now boarding for the flight to London, the gate agent announced over the intercom. Come on, sweetheart, let's go. As our plane lifted off American soil, I imagined Colin, Brooke, and Margaret somewhere back in Westchester, toasting to the beginning of their perfect new life, utterly convinced of the future ahead of them. They had no idea what was coming. I wondered, with a coldness that surprised me, what their faces would look like when they found out exactly who they'd thrown away. The city lights shrank beneath the clouds until they disappeared entirely. Goodbye, Colin. I took a slow breath and thought about the new life waiting for us in London, but one question kept circling back, refusing to let me rest. Why had Brooke looked so strangely triumphant during that whole humiliating scene in the kitchen? Not just relieved, but victorious, like she'd won something bigger than a husband. Was that baby even his? I stared at my own reflection in the dark window of the plane. Somewhere behind my eyes, a small, cold flame had started to burn, and it had nothing to do with sadness. After the call with Richard, I led Nora to a bench near our gate. Outside, the runway lights blurred through a light drizzle. Soon we'd be on one of those planes, leaving all of it behind. But Richard's words kept replaying in my head like a scratched record. A woman with no skills can't raise a child alone. I had become a housewife because Colin insisted on it. Because he told me, over and over, that a woman's place was managing the home so a man could build a career. And now that arrangement was inconvenient for them, and suddenly I was the incompetent one, the dependent one, the woman who couldn't possibly survive without a man's income. I had been so much more than a convenient housekeeper. They had simply never once cared to look closer. Mommy? Nora tugged my sleeve, pulling me out of my own head. Sorry, sweetheart. Are you hungry? She nodded, and we walked to a small newsstand near the gate. Her face lit up at the rack of candy. Watching her pick out a ridiculous pink box of chocolate-covered pretzels gave me the first genuine moment of peace I'd had in hours. I had to be strong for her. That was the whole plan now. The entire plan. This one, she said, holding it up proudly. Perfect choice. Let's go pay. As I reached for my wallet, a voice rang out behind us, sharp and delighted in the worst way. Well, if it isn't little Nora. I turned to find Paige, Colin's younger sister, standing there in a designer coat, dragging an obnoxiously expensive suitcase behind her. Paige had always treated me with exactly the same condescension as her mother and brother, as though my presence in the family was something to be tolerated rather than welcomed. Paige, what are you doing here? She laughed, waving a hand dismissively. Girls trip to Turks and Caicos, obviously. Funny running into you too, though. Where are you headed this late? With a suitcase that big? Her eyes dropped to my luggage with open curiosity. Somewhere far away, I said, keeping my voice even. Far away, huh? Paige's gaze slid between me and Nora, delighted. Oh, right. Colin told me you left the papers on the table and just walked out. Mom's furious. Says you're incredibly inconsiderate, leaving without so much as a proper conversation. Her voice carried, loud enough that the cashier and a few nearby travelers glanced over. My face burned, but I forced myself to stay level. Inconsiderate. I didn't just leave, Paige. Colin told me he was marrying Brooke. Well, if you want to look at it that way, sure, my brother chose Brooke over you. You can't really blame him. He's a man. He wants someone young. And Brooke's pregnant, Paige added brightly. Mom's thrilled we'll finally get a proper heir. The words were an exact echo of her mother's, which told me everything about where that particular poison had originated. To this family, Brooke's pregnancy wasn't a scandal. It was a permission slip. Poor Nora, Paige said, glancing down at my daughter with a look of theatrical pity. Abandoned by her own father because her mother couldn't hold on to him. Paige, do not talk about my daughter like that in front of her. My voice cracked with something sharper than I intended. I didn't care what she said about me. I would not let her touch Nora with it. It's the truth, though, isn't it? A stay-at-home mom with no skills, trying to raise a kid solo. You'll be broke inside a month, crawling back to my brother begging for a check. She laughed and adjusted the strap of her handbag. Good luck out there. We're going to be very happy with Brooke and the new baby. See you around. With a flip of her hair, she sauntered off toward her own gate. My hands were shaking with rage by the time she disappeared into the crowd. Mommy. Nora squeezed my hand, and her warmth was the only thing that kept the ice inside my chest from cracking wide open right there in the middle of the terminal. It's okay, sweetheart. We're going to be happy. Just the two of us. I smiled at her and paid for the chocolate. The boarding call echoed through the terminal again. It was time. Paige's words followed me down the jet bridge. Broke inside a month. That family was so certain I was helpless. A woman capable of nothing beyond laundry and dinner reservations. And in their eyes, that had always been true. What they didn't know, what none of them had ever bothered to find out, was that for 15 years I hadn't only been folding towels and managing a calendar. I touched the phone in my coat pocket, thinking of the contact saved there under a single initial. It held a card I'd been quietly preparing to play for a very long time. Colin, Margaret, Paige, Brooke. Every one of them believed at that moment that they had already won. The future they were toasting to wasn't going to last nearly as long as they thought. As I climbed the steps onto the plane, I looked up at the dark sky above the tarmac. Leaving America that night, my chest wasn't full of grief. It was full of something quieter and far more dangerous. A slow, patient resolve. I found myself almost eager to see the exact shape their faces would take on the day they finally understood what they'd thrown away. But underneath that resolve sat one small, cold thought I couldn't shake. If Brooke's pregnancy really was what I suspected it might be, the story that was about to unfold would be far darker than even I could imagine. The cabin door sealed shut. I fastened Nora's seatbelt, then my own, and stared out into the dark. As the plane began to taxi, my heart quickened toward whatever waited for us on the other side of the ocean. Whether it held light or ruin, neither of us could know yet. After a flight of nearly 8 hours, we landed at Heathrow in the gray hush of early evening. A low canopy of cloud sat over the runway, and a fine, cold mist, the kind London seems to specialize in, was already soaking through my coat by the time we reached the taxi line. "Mommy, I'm cold," Nora murmured, exhausted, tugging weakly at my sleeve. "I know, baby. We'll be at a warm hotel soon." I pulled her close and hurried us into a cab. Despite every ounce of hope I'd been holding onto for this new beginning, the gray, glistening cityscape sliding past the window only sharpened my anxiety instead of easing it. We arrived at the small boutique hotel I'd booked weeks earlier in central London, tucked behind a row of cream townhouses. As I checked in at the front desk, the elderly clerk behind the counter frowned at his screen. "I'm terribly sorry, madam, but this card has been declined." "That can't be right. Could you try again, please?" "I've tried 3 times now. It appears to be locked. Perhaps another card?" I pulled a second card from my wallet with hands that had started, very slightly, to shake. Declined again. I tried an ATM in the lobby with a debit card I'd brought from the States as a last resort. Declined a third time. I felt the blood drain out of my face. I connected my phone to the hotel's guest Wi-Fi and pulled up my banking app. And there it was. Every joint account Colin and I had ever shared, frozen or emptied entirely, time-stamped less than 4 hours earlier. He hadn't wasted a single minute. I had prepared for a lot of things. I had not quite prepared for the particular petty cruelty of a man who would freeze his own daughter's access to hot water and a hotel bed out of pure spite, on the very night he'd finally gotten what he wanted. "Madam, will there be another form of payment?" the clerk asked gently, clearly uncomfortable. Give me a moment. I'm so sorry." I stepped away from the desk, Nora's small hand clutched in mine, and walked back out into the rain, my mind scrambling through every option I had left. I had exactly one contact in this city I could call in an emergency, a number I'd been saving for exactly this kind of moment, and I wasn't ready to use it yet. Not like this. Not soaked through and humiliated on a London sidewalk with my daughter shivering beside me. We ended up on a bench under the hotel's awning, watching the rain fall in silver sheets over the street. Nora had gone quiet in the particular way exhausted children do right before they either cry or fall asleep sitting up. I pulled her against my side and stared at the wet pavement, feeling, for the first time since I'd signed those papers, something close to real despair. "A woman with no skills can't raise a child alone," Richard's voice echoed. For one terrible moment, standing there soaked and broke on a foreign street, I almost believed him. That was when a black car, not one of London's classic cabs, but a long, gleaming sedan, eased to a stop at the curb in front of us, tires hissing through a puddle. The rear door opened without a sound, and a figure stepped out beneath a large black umbrella, polished shoes navigating the wet pavement with an ease that suggested he'd never once worried about ruining them. "What on earth are you doing out here, in weather like this?" The rain that had been soaking straight through my coat suddenly stopped. I lifted my face and found myself looking at someone I had never, in 100 versions of this night, expected to see standing on a London street. "You," I said. "What are you doing here?" He crouched slightly, draping a soft cashmere coat over Nora's shivering shoulders, then straightened and offered me a calm, familiar smile. "I've come to collect you," he said. "Please, come with me. Your daughter's going to catch a chill." "Mr. Pierce, what are you doing here?" I stared at him as if I were seeing a ghost, because in a way, I sort of was. Standing before me, holding his umbrella against the London rain, was Julian Pierce, the head of the London office of Harrington Global Partners, a British investment fund that happened to be the single largest client of the trading firm where Colin worked. I'd met him a handful of times over the years, always briefly, always through the careful distance I maintained between my two lives. His salt and pepper hair, his impeccably tailored coat, his calm, unhurried manner, exactly as I remembered. What I could not understand was what he was doing standing on a random London street at the exact moment I needed him most. "I imagine this is quite a shock," he said in the same unhurried tone. "We can talk properly in the car. Please." He opened the rear door. Still reeling, I carried a shivering Nora into the warm interior, and Julian slid in beside us, murmuring a quiet instruction to the driver before the car pulled smoothly away from the curb. "Madam, I owe you an apology for such an unconventional welcome," he began. "I heard your flight had been delayed and was on my way to the airport myself, but by the time I checked with the hotel, you'd already left the desk in some distress. I'm afraid we didn't move quickly enough." "But how did you know which hotel I'd booked? Why are you here at all, Mr. Pierce?" My mind was still spinning. He offered an apologetic half-smile. "I received very specific instructions to look after you personally. He's the one who arranged the hotel, actually. Though I confess, none of us anticipated your ex-husband would go so far as to freeze your cards on the very night you landed." "He," I repeated, my breath catching. My mind went instantly to the phone in my coat pocket, to a single contact saved there, a man whose name almost none of my old family had ever heard. "Your employer," Julian confirmed, watching my face carefully. Mr. Edmund Harrington, your longtime business partner. I lowered my eyes. Not Colin, not Margaret, not Paige. Not a single person in that entire family had any idea about the life I'd been quietly living behind their backs. Before my marriage, I'd worked as a junior equities analyst at a respected firm in the city, fluent in 3 languages, with a particular gift for untangling complicated cross-border transactions that made senior partners twice my age nervous. When I married Colin, I officially resigned at his insistence. "A woman's place is in the home," he'd said, and I'd believed, at 23, that this was simply what love asked of you. But my old boss, Edmund Harrington, had never quite let go of the idea that he was losing one of the sharpest minds he'd ever worked with. When he left to start his own investment fund a year later, he quietly hired me back. Not on any official roster, not with a title, not with a desk anywhere Colin would ever see it. I became, in every functional sense, a ghost analyst. All of my work happened from home, on a laptop tucked into the back of a closet, during the hours Colin was at the office or asleep. I translated foreign market reports, modeled currency exposure, wrote analysis that landed on the desks of people who never knew my name attached to a face. My compensation went into a private offshore account Colin didn't know existed, a woman with no skills. "Whose money do you think you're living on?" Colin and Margaret had thrown that line at me more times than I could count over the years, and every single time I had laughed quietly on the inside, because the income I generated through that laptop in the closet had, for most of the last decade, outpaced Colin's entire salary. "He contacted me the moment he heard you'd finally left," Julian said, tapping something into a tablet. "He said, and I'm quoting him directly, that keeping a mind like yours locked inside that house for 15 years was a genuine loss to the global economy. Starting Monday, you'll be joining our London office as a senior analyst. Your desk is already prepared." I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 15 years. The car's warmth and the sheer, overwhelming relief of it finally began to thaw something frozen in my chest. Nora, wrapped in Julian's borrowed coat, had already drifted back to sleep against my arm. "Thank you," I managed. "I never imagined you'd come collect me personally." "We couldn't risk losing an asset this valuable," Julian said simply. Then his expression shifted, sharpening slightly. "And there's another matter. Mr. Harrington asked me to raise it with you tonight if you were ready." He turned the tablet toward me. On the screen, the name of Colin's trading firm, and beneath it, a dense column of recent transaction data. "There's a second assignment," he said. "A full investigation into your ex-husband, Colin Ashford, and the accounts he manages." "Colin's accounts?" "Indeed. We've noticed irregular capital flows tied to a deal he's been overseeing for several months. We'd already begun a quiet, internal inquiry before you left. It appears your ex-husband may be involved in something considerably riskier than his employers realize." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the London cold. Colin had always been a man consumed by vanity and status, endlessly frustrated that his career had stalled behind men he considered his inferiors. I'd vaguely wondered, in the back of my mind, how he'd suddenly afforded designer bags and 5-star dinners for a mistress on a mid-level trader's salary. "Mr. Pierce, are you saying he's been stealing from the firm? We can't say with certainty yet, but the pattern strongly suggests embezzlement, and not a particularly clean version of it. If it comes to light, he won't simply be fired, he'll be arrested." "Arrested?" The word sat heavy in the car. "And there's one more thing," Julian continued, his tone dropping into something almost clinical. "The woman he intends to marry, Brooke. We looked into her as well." "You investigated Brooke?" "A woman capable of pushing you to this extreme deserved a thorough background check. Wouldn't you agree? And we found something rather interesting." He gave me a small, cold smile. "Her pregnancy. Do you truly believe that child belongs to your ex-husband? I felt the air leave my lungs, the unease I'd carried onto the plane, the memory of Brooke's strange, triumphant expression in that kitchen. It all clicked into place with a sickening kind of clarity. What are you telling me? It appears she's been involved with several men beyond your ex-husband. One of them, we believe, is a senior partner at his own firm. A senior partner? My head spun. She chose Colin on purpose, because he was the easiest one to fool. That's our working theory, yes. Her plan appears to be extracting a large settlement, either from him directly, or from whatever assets she believes he's taking from you. Julian closed the tablet and looked at me directly. Madam, you've endured unfair treatment and quiet service for far too long. You don't owe that family another moment of it. We intend to give you full support for whatever comes next. The car slowed in front of a beautiful brick townhouse tucked into a quiet residential square, ivy climbing one wall, warm light glowing behind the curtains. This will be your home for as long as you need it, Julian said. Security is thorough, and everything you and your daughter require has already been arranged. Please, get some rest tonight. As the driver held an umbrella for me and I carried Nora out of the car, the rain had finally stopped completely, and a sliver of moon had broken through the clouds. Somewhere across the ocean, Colin, Margaret, Paige, and Brooke were probably still toasting their victory, certain they had successfully driven me out into the cold to fail on my own. They had no idea what resources I actually had behind me. Let's begin, I murmured into the quiet London night, my voice steadier than it had been in months. My face, lit faintly by the moon, was no longer the face of a woman who cried. While I greeted a quiet London dawn, my ex-husband's family was 3,000 miles away, still riding high on the fumes of their victory. With that gloomy woman finally gone, this house feels so much brighter, Margaret chirped, slicing a cantaloupe in the kitchen I had scrubbed and organized for 15 years, humming to herself in a way I doubt she'd done in front of me even once. Brooke lounged across the living room sofa in a flashy maternity dress, scrolling through her phone. It's true. She was always so depressing to be around. Being near her felt suffocating, she said in that sugary, performative voice she used whenever Margaret was in earshot. Colin nodded, satisfied, pulling Brooke closer to press a kiss to her temple. Exactly. No skills, but somehow all that pride. She's probably homeless on some street in London right now. He laughed, a low, cruel sound. I canceled every card, drained the joint account down to 0. Bet she's going to come crawling back on the phone in a week. Not that I'll help her. A brand new luxury watch glinted on his wrist, one I was fairly certain neither of us could have afforded on his actual salary. His face was full of the specific, oblivious confidence of a man who has no idea the floor beneath him is already cracking. Colin, honey, Brooke said, resting a hand on her belly. Once the baby comes, I really think we should look at penthouses. Something with a view. Whatever you want, babe. My promotion's basically locked in, and there's plenty more where this came from. None of them had the faintest idea what was quietly unraveling beneath their feet. The next morning, Colin, Margaret, and Brooke arrived at one of Chicago's most exclusive obstetrics practices on the Gold Coast, the kind of clinic where the waiting rooms smelled like eucalyptus and the receptionists wore cashmere. Well, if we're bringing this family's heir into the world, it may as well be somewhere respectable, Margaret said, glancing disdainfully at the other expectant mothers in the waiting room. Colin flipped through a golf magazine, trying his best to look like a man who belonged in rooms like this one. Brooke Sinclair, the doctor will see you now. A nurse led all three of them into the exam room. How are you feeling today? Let's take a look at baby with the ultrasound, the veteran physician said warmly, helping Brooke onto the exam table. Gel went onto her stomach, and a grainy black and white image bloomed across the monitor. Look, he's moving, Brooke said, beaming, pointing at the screen. "Wow, that's my son," Colin murmured, awestruck. "He's got my chin already." It was at that exact moment the doctor's expression shifted. He leaned closer to the monitor, then glanced down at the tablet in his hand, comparing numbers, his brow furrowing. "Doctor? Is something wrong?" Colin asked, an edge of nerves creeping into his voice. "No, no, the baby's developing perfectly well," the doctor said slowly. "It's simply that, Miss Sinclair. Based on the measurements here, you're currently at roughly 20 weeks, entering your 5th month." Colin and Margaret exchanged a look. "That has to be a mistake," Margaret said sharply. "Brooke and my son have only been together 3 months. She should be 3 months along, not 5. The doctor shook his head, unbothered. "No, the fetal measurements are quite consistent. 5 months. And," he added, glancing at something else in her chart, "I see you've actually visited this office once before, 2 months ago. You were accompanied that time by an older gentleman. The intake form listed him as your husband." The room went completely silent. "What?" The color drained straight out of Colin's face. Margaret stood frozen, her mouth slightly open. "Brooke," Margaret said, her voice trembling with the effort of staying composed. 5 months. That means you were pregnant before you ever started seeing my son. Who was this other man?" On the table, Brooke had gone pale as chalk, her lips trembling. "No, that's not right. The machine must be malfunctioning. The doctor's mistaken." At that exact moment, Colin's phone rang, the sound sharp and jarring in the frozen silence of the exam room. His boss's name lit up the screen. "Miller." "Sorry, Ashford." "Yeah, this is Colin." His voice cracked with confusion as his boss's furious voice blasted through the speaker, loud enough that Margaret could hear every word. "Get back to the office right now. Compliance is tearing through every project you've touched in the last 8 months. What in God's name is going on?" "Compliance? What's this about?" The phone slipped from Colin's hand and clattered onto the tile floor. A fake pregnancy. An embezzlement investigation breaking open in the very same hour. The flimsy, self-satisfied castle Colin had spent months building for himself was about to come down in a single, deafening collapse. The London sky the next morning was a sharp, cloudless blue, a strange contrast to the previous night's cold rain. In the townhouse's living room, a fire crackling in the hearth, I tucked a second blanket over Nora, still asleep on the plush sofa. "I'll be back soon," I whispered, then stepped into the car Julian had sent for me. We drove into the heart of the city, toward a glass tower that seemed to catch every angle of the morning light. On the top floor, behind a heavy door, an older man rose from behind a wide mahogany desk. "Thank you for coming, Margot. I'm sorry to pull you into this so soon after such a long flight." "Mr. Harrington, it's been a long time." Edmund Harrington was the man who had quietly employed me as a ghost analyst for 15 years, the head of a formidable investment fund, and, not incidentally, the majority shareholder in the very trading firm where Colin worked. He was a man whose quiet word could move markets, and whose sharp mind had never once underestimated me the way my own family had. "Actually," he said, "I think it's time we used your proper title. The senior analyst this firm has been quietly proud of for over a decade. Your ex-husband called you a woman with no skills, I understand. Extraordinary, treating one of the sharpest minds I've worked with like household staff. Mr. Harrington, thank you for protecting my privacy all these years, and for everything since," I said, bowing my head slightly. His expression sobered as he slid a tablet across the desk toward me. "The initial report you sent before you left the States, your suspicions about your ex-husband's conduct, was flawless. I put pressure on compliance in the New York office immediately and opened a discreet internal investigation." "But there's a problem," I guessed. "Yes. It's clear Colin Ashford has been siphoning company funds. A significant sum, several $1 million at minimum, but it's been routed through a maze of offshore shell entities, and our internal team has hit a wall trying to trace the final destination. He looked at me directly. Margot, I need you to use your particular gift here. Unravel this maze. Bring me the final piece. I took the tablet in silence. The screen filled with a dense, chaotic web of transactions. To most people, gibberish. To me, a pattern was already forming, faint but unmistakable, like a watermark held up to light. My fingers moved across the keyboard. This wasn't like the old days, hunched in a closet corner with a laptop balanced on my knees, listening for footsteps on the stairs. Here, there was no one to hide from. My real skill set, the one I'd spent 15 years being told didn't exist, was waking back up, stretching its legs for the first time in years. A few minutes later, I said quietly, "Found it." Julian and Edmund leaned in. These shell companies look unrelated on the surface, but every single one of them ultimately funnels into one private account in the Cayman Islands. I pointed to a name on the screen. And this is the director of the entity managing that account. Good God, Julian murmured. Edmund's eyes went wide. That name. Yes, I confirmed, my voice flat and cold. It's the same name Julian's team flagged yesterday in the background check on Brooke Sinclair, the older man who accompanied her to that first clinic visit. Her real patron. I laid it out clearly. Colin had been embezzling from the firm and funneling that money into this man's shell operation, disguised as an investment vehicle. Brooke and this man had been working together from the very beginning, targeting Colin specifically. So he was tricked into believing he'd fathered his mistress's child, Edmund said slowly, all while being used, without knowing it, to launder millions out of his own company. A brilliant piece of deduction, Julian said, genuinely impressed. You truly are exceptional at this. Send this to compliance in New York immediately, Edmund said. Every page. Meanwhile, back in a windowless conference room at Ashford's New York office, Colin sat surrounded by 3 compliance officers, sweat gathering at his hairline. There's no way I embezzled anything, Colin insisted, slamming a fist on the table. I'm the top performer on this floor. This is a mistake. The head of compliance stared at him, unmoved. A notification pinged on her laptop. She opened it, and her expression shifted instantly. We just received a file from our majority shareholder's London office, she said. It contains a complete account of the fund flows tied to your projects. What? She slid a printed page across the table, a meticulously mapped diagram tracing every shell company back to a single account, the very account belonging to Brooke's actual patron. It appears you were completely used, she said. Millions of dollars embezzled from this firm, and every dollar of it ended up in the hands of a con artist you were unknowingly funding for your mistress's benefit. No, that's impossible. Brooke loves me. Who put this together? Colin's voice cracked, his eyes bloodshot. Who wrote this garbage? This, the compliance officer said coolly, is a flawless report prepared by a top-tier analyst employed by our majority shareholder. Though I have to admit, I was surprised by the byline. She turned the page toward him and tapped the name printed at the bottom. Prepared by Margot Ashford, Senior Analyst, Harrington Global Partners. Colin's eyes locked onto the letters. Margot? No. That's not... It can't be. The shock hit him like a physical blow. The woman he'd dismissed, humiliated, and thrown out of his own house was now the person holding the exact evidence that was about to end his career, his freedom, and his marriage before it had even begun. I'm telling you, you're wrong. I'm 3 months along. 5 months isn't possible. Back at the Gold Coast Clinic, Brooke's voice had climbed into a shriek, her face ashen as she scrambled to hold her lie together. But the ultrasound clearly shows, the bewildered doctor began. Margaret was already trembling with fury. Brooke, 5 months. That means you were pregnant before you ever laid eyes on my son. And who was that older man who came with you 2 months ago? Her shrill voice bounced off the exam room walls. The composed, imperious woman I'd known for 15 years had completely dissolved into something feral. Margaret, please, that's not true. This is Colin's baby, I swear it. Don't you dare lie to me. Doctors don't lie, Brooke. You got yourself pregnant by some other man and tried to trap my son into raising his child. Margaret actually lunged at her, and it took the nurse and the doctor both to pull her back before real damage was done. Stop. You're hurting me. I'll tell Colin what you did, Brooke sobbed. And where exactly is your precious Colin right now? Margaret snapped. Pulled away by some compliance department not even answering his phone. The door burst open. Paige stood there, breathless, mascara already streaked down her face. Mom, it's bad. Dad just called. Colin's been arrested. Fraud. Embezzlement. Arrested? Margaret and Brooke's voices collided in the same instant. He apparently siphoned millions and funneled it into some shell company. Paige's eyes cut toward Brooke, venomous. And guess whose account it all landed in? Your little patron's, Brooke. Margaret stared, blank, unable to process the sentence. You mean this woman was running a con on my son from the very beginning? And that baby, Paige said, is probably that other man's, not Colin's. The last bit of color drained from Brooke's face. It had been, up until roughly 6 hours ago, a nearly perfect plan. Colin, vain, insecure, and desperate to prove himself, had been the ideal mark. Get him to leave his wife, marry Brooke, and quietly bleed his firm dry from the inside while everyone congratulated him on his new life. Every piece had been falling exactly into place. How? Brooke stammered. How could anyone have found this? Don't play dumb. Paige shoved her phone in front of Margaret and Brooke both. The person who exposed the whole thing is the senior analyst working for my brother's firm's majority shareholder. On the screen, a breaking finance headline. Harrington Global Partners names, new senior analyst, uncovers multi-million-dollar fraud in confidential internal probe. Below it, a photo of a composed, confident woman standing against the London skyline. This can't be real, Margaret whispered, sinking onto the exam table's little rolling stool. The useless, incompetent housewife she'd spent 15 years berating was, apparently, a senior analyst at one of the largest funds in Europe. The woman in that photo, unmistakably, was me, but not in an apron, not folding laundry, a tailored blazer, a skyline behind her, a face that had clearly stopped apologizing for existing. She took everything, Brooke said, staring at the phone, her face collapsing into pure despair. They finally understood. The woman they'd spent years grinding underfoot had actually been holding a live wire the entire time, and they were the ones who'd finally reached out and grabbed it. Brooke fled the clinic on foot, sprinting through a sudden downpour, heels clicking wildly against the wet pavement, heedless of the mud splashing up her expensive dress. She dialed her patron over and over, a man named Victor Calloway, a career con artist who ran a handful of shell companies out of a rented office downtown. But every call rolled straight to voicemail. He'd approached her months earlier with the entire plan already mapped out. Fake a pregnancy, seduce a vain, insecure trader, and let him unknowingly funnel his own company's money straight into their pockets. It was supposed to have been flawless. Brooke finally reached the door of Victor's high-rise apartment, using her spare key with shaking hands, stumbling into a scene of total chaos. Papers were scattered across the floor. Victor, a heavy-set man well into his 50s, sat hunched over his laptop, pounding the keyboard with bloodshot, panicked eyes. Vinny, please, Colin's been arrested. What do we do? Shut up. He didn't even look up. Every one of my offshore accounts is frozen. Some analyst out of London tore apart every transfer I've made in the last 2 years. The feds are already circling. It's over. My entire operation is finished, and it's your fault for not managing that idiot properly. He crossed the room in 3 strides and slapped her hard enough to send her stumbling into the wall. Vinny, please. What about me? What about the baby? It's yours. He laughed, an ugly, humorless sound. My child? Don't flatter yourself. I had a vasectomy 8 years ago. Whatever's in there, it isn't mine, and I couldn't care less whose it actually is. Brooke felt the room tilt. You told me to say it was Colin's. I told you to get pregnant by whoever was convenient and use it as leverage. You were a tool, Brooke. A collection method. And now, you're a useless one. He grabbed a duffel bag, stuffed it with whatever cash and jewelry he could find, and shoved past her toward the door, leaving her alone on the cold hardwood floor, one hand pressed to her stomach, shaking too hard to even cry. At the precinct, Colin sat handcuffed in a dim interrogation room, staring at nothing. Across from him, a veteran detective with graying hair flipped through a thick case file. Colin Ashford. Every dollar you funneled out traces back to accounts belonging to a career con man named Victor Calloway. The woman you've been so infatuated with, Brooke, was working for him the entire time. That's a lie. Brooke loves me. She's carrying my child. The detective let out a long, exhausted breath and slapped a document onto the table. She's been involved with multiple men, Mr. Ashford. We don't even need a DNA test to tell you that baby isn't yours. You fell for a stranger's lie, betrayed your employer, lost your family, and handed millions of dollars to a con artist. You're not a victim here. You're a mark. Fat, humiliated tears rolled down Colin's face. He had spent years believing himself an elite, a man who deserved better than a boring wife, a man who was owed a younger, more beautiful partner as some kind of reward for existing. The truth, delivered flatly across a metal table, was considerably less flattering. What happens to me now? Wire fraud, grand larceny. The total damages run into the millions. You're not walking away from prison time, and you can count on being fired for cause, followed by a substantial civil suit from your former employer. Your life, as you knew it, is finished. Colin buried his face in his hands and sobbed. Save the tears, the detective said, unmoved. You've got a visitor. Someone with the worst possible news to add to your day. The heavy door creaked open. The moment Colin saw who was standing there, he nearly fell out of his chair. It was his own father. Richard looked nothing like the composed, quietly dignified man Colin had grown up under. His hair was disheveled, his face gray, as though he'd aged a full decade overnight. Dad. You came. Help me, I was set up. Brooke did this to me. Richard slammed a thick envelope onto the table with enough force that the detective flinched. Set up. Richard's voice came out low, almost guttural. Do you have any idea what you've done? The company is suing you for $5 million in damages, the exact amount you embezzled, because you talked me into co-signing financial bonds for your so-called investment opportunities. My retirement. The house. All of it is being seized. No, that can't. You betrayed your employer. You betrayed this family. And on top of it, you handed our entire life savings to some con artist's mistress, all while throwing away the one real thing you had. Richard's voice cracked on the last words, and I later learned that by the time he said them, he already knew exactly who I'd become. Dad, I'm sorry. I was a fool. Get me a lawyer, please. Do something. It's too late for that. As of today, you are no longer my son. Don't ever call this number again. Richard turned and walked out of the room, tears sliding silently down his own face, leaving Colin alone with the detective and the wreckage of everything he'd built. At the same time, an entirely different collapse was underway at the Ashford family home. "This is absurd! This is my house!" Margaret was shrieking at a pair of court officers standing at her front door, clipboards in hand. "Ma'am, this is a provisional asset seizure related to your son's embezzlement case. You're required to vacate the premises immediately. All furnishings remain on the property." Paige burst into tears behind her mother. "Mom, what are we supposed to do? My cards for Turks and Caicos are already declined. They're going to take my bags, my jewelry." "Be quiet, Paige. I don't know what we're going to do any more than you do." A figure stumbled up the front walk, soaked through, an expensive maternity dress caked in mud. Brooke, abandoned by Victor with absolutely nowhere else to go, had come to the one place left that might still owe her something. "Margaret, please, I need help. I was lied to. I have nothing left." The moment Margaret's eyes landed on her, something in her face went completely feral. "How dare you show up here, you conniving little thief?" She crossed the lawn and grabbed a fistful of Brooke's hair before anyone could stop her. "Let go of me, you old witch. Who are you calling old? And that baby isn't even my son's, is it? Because of you, my son is a criminal. Give me back my life." Paige joined in, hurling Brooke's designer handbag into a puddle at the curb. "You should just disappear." It took the court officers nearly 5 full minutes to pull the 3 of them apart, all of them soaked, muddy, and screaming, while a small crowd of neighbors watched from behind their curtains. The same neighbors who, until that morning, had spent 15 years admiring the Ashford family's perfect front lawn and perfect reputation. The weeks that followed felt at times like waking up inside someone else's life. Our townhouse in Belgravia had 4 bedrooms, a small garden out back with a crooked apple tree, and a kitchen with actual sunlight in it. Something our old house, for all its square footage, had somehow never managed. Nora started at a small international primary school 3 streets over, and within 2 weeks she'd made a best friend named Priya and had opinions about British slang that she deployed constantly and with great confidence. "Mummy, it's not trash, it's rubbish," she informed me one evening, hands on her hips, and I laughed until I cried, because it was the first time in longer than I could remember that laughing and crying had come from the exact same place. I threw myself into work in a way I hadn't been allowed to in 15 years. Harrington Global Partners occupied 4 floors of a glass tower near Liverpool Street, and my new office had a view of the Thames that I still, some mornings, had to stop and actually look at, just to remind myself it was real. Julian became something between a colleague and a friend, walking me through the internal politics of a firm I'd only ever known from the outside. Edmund checked in every few days, always with the same dry, understated warmth. "You're better than the report I read 15 years ago," he told me once, over tea in his office. Which I did not think was possible. Back in the States, the story of Colin's arrest had detonated across the financial press. "Rising trader, arrested in multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme." The articles were careful, procedural, full of phrases like alleged and pending investigation, but the internet had never once cared about being careful. Screenshots of Colin's old LinkedIn, the one where he'd called himself a visionary in capital markets, circulated with a level of mockery that I did not, if I'm honest, feel a single ounce of sympathy about. I read the coverage the way you'd read a weather report from a city you used to live in. Interested, a little detached, no longer inside the storm. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, nearly 6 weeks after I'd landed in London, Edmund called me into his office with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Something closer to excitement than his usual careful reserve. "Sit down, Margot. We need to talk about the firm's next move." I sat. "Ashford Sterling Capital," he said, sliding a folder across the desk, "is in freefall. The embezzlement scandal has triggered a mass client exodus. Their stock, what little of it is publicly traded through the parent holding company, has lost nearly 60% of its value in 5 weeks. The board is desperate for a buyer who can restore even a shred of institutional confidence. And you want Harrington to buy it. I want to buy it, Edmund said, and I want you to run it. I actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. Edmund, that's my ex-husband's firm. I'm aware. His eyes were completely serious. You understand every rotten timber in that building better than anyone alive, Margot. You know exactly which relationships were built on genuine competence and which were built on nepotism and golf memberships. You have, without question, the sharpest read on their financial exposure of anyone we could possibly hire. And frankly, he added, allowing himself the smallest, driest smile, I find a certain justice in it. I sat with the idea for a long moment, staring out at the river. There was a version of me, the version who had spent 15 years disappearing herself into someone else's expectations, that would have flinched from this, would have called it too much, too personal, too close to revenge dressed up as business strategy. But I wasn't that woman anymore, and frankly, I didn't especially want to be. What would the timeline look like? I asked. Edmund's smile widened just slightly. That's my girl. Over the following weeks, Harrington's legal and acquisitions teams moved with a quiet, relentless efficiency I found genuinely thrilling to watch. Ashford Sterling's board, cornered by collapsing client confidence and mounting legal fees from Colin's ongoing criminal case, had essentially no leverage left to negotiate from. Edmund structured the acquisition not as a hostile takeover, but as a rescue, the kind of deal a drowning company doesn't get to be picky about. I flew back and forth between London and New York twice during the negotiation, always careful, always working through lawyers and intermediaries, never once setting foot anywhere Colin's family might see me coming. I wanted the reveal to happen exactly once, in exactly one room, on exactly my terms. Julian handled most of the logistics. The creditors' meeting is scheduled for the 14th, he told me one afternoon, reviewing a stack of documents. Full family attendance is mandatory under the terms of the civil judgment. Ashford, his parents, his sister, all required to appear in person to hear the terms of the settlement. Good, I said. You'll be announced as the new majority owner and incoming CEO at the start of the meeting. Good, I said again, and meant it in a way that surprised even me. Not with anger, exactly. Something steadier than that. Something that felt, for the first time in a very long time, like justice instead of revenge. The night before the meeting, I sat on the edge of Nora's bed after story time, watching her breathe in the particular, deep, unbothered way only children manage. Mommy has a work thing tomorrow, I told her quietly, mostly to myself. A pretty important one. She murmured something half asleep about wanting pancakes, and I smiled, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. 15 years ago, I had been told over and over, in a dozen different cruel variations, that I was worth nothing without a man's name attached to mine. Tomorrow, I was going to walk into a room full of people who had believed that lie completely, and I was going to let them watch, in real time, exactly how wrong they'd been. The Ashford Sterling Capital boardroom occupied the top floor of a building Colin had once pointed to from the street, years earlier, and told me, that's where I'll have an office someday. Corner 1, with the view. He'd said it with the particular hunger of a man who measured his own worth entirely in square footage and floor number. He never got the corner office. What he got, on the morning of the 14th, was a folding chair near the far end of a mahogany conference table, flanked by a rumpled gray sweatsuit that did nothing to hide the outline of the handcuffs beneath a folded jacket draped over his hands. He hadn't shaved in what looked like days. The arrogance that had defined every version of him I'd ever known was simply gone, evaporated, leaving behind something smaller and considerably less certain of itself. Beside him sat Richard, Margaret, and Paige, all three of them pale, hollow, dressed in clothes that had clearly come from somewhere considerably less expensive than their usual wardrobes. "Why?" Margaret muttered, mostly to herself, no longer in a single designer thread. "Why is this happening to us?" The asset seizure had left the family with almost nothing. They were, by every account Julian had shared with me, currently deciding between groceries and gas money on a weekly basis. "It's your fault," Paige hissed at her brother, her voice cracking with something between grief and hysteria. "Because you fell for some con artist, my whole life is ruined. I can't even afford dinner tonight." Colin stared at the table, unresponsive, a man who had run out of anything left to say in his own defense. "Enough," Richard said, though his voice had none of its old command left in it. He looked, I thought when I finally saw him, like a man who'd aged a full decade in the span of 6 weeks. They were gathered there, all four of them, to receive formal terms for $10 million in punitive damages owed to the company's new ownership. The heavy mahogany doors swung open, and the room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees in an instant. Security came first. 2 broad-shouldered men in dark suits, followed by Julian and a small team of sharply dressed attorneys from Harrington's London office. They cleared a respectful path for one final arrival. I walked in wearing a custom navy suit I'd had tailored the week before, my hair pulled back, heels clicking with a decisiveness against the polished floor that I'd spent 15 years being told I didn't have the right to sound like. There was no trace left, anywhere in me, of the woman who used to tiptoe around this family's moods in a stained apron. The moment they saw my face, a strangled collective gasp went around the table. Richard, Margaret, and Paige stared, wide-eyed, as if they'd genuinely forgotten how to breathe. Their minds visibly struggled to reconcile the woman in front of them, radiating a kind of authority none of them had ever once associated with me, with the Margot they'd thrown out of a kitchen 6 weeks earlier. Margaret recovered first, retreating, predictably, into denial. "Margot, what are you doing here? Did you come to gloat while we're on the verge of bankruptcy? You've always been a spiteful woman, honestly. And what gives you any right to walk into a room like this like you own the place? You're a useless housewife. Go make yourself useful and get us some coffee." Her insults landed in the silent room and simply dissolved, unanswered. Richard tried weakly to quiet her. Her pride wouldn't allow it. I said nothing. I looked at her the way you might look at something small and unfortunate that had wandered into the wrong room, and let the silence stretch until it did the work for me. Margaret's voice faltered and finally died on its own. Without a word, I walked to the head of the table, the seat that had once belonged to Ashford Sterling's president, and sat down. "How rude," Julian said in his crisp, precise English, standing at my shoulder. "It seems none of you fully understand who you're addressing." "What are you talking about?" Margaret sputtered. "She's our useless former daughter-in-law." One of the attorneys set a thick folder on the table with a decisive thud. "You will address her with respect. The woman seated in front of you is the senior analyst for Harrington Global Partners, one of the largest institutional investors in Europe. And, as of 8 o'clock this morning, the newly appointed president and chief executive officer of this company, Margot Ashford." Margaret's jaw dropped. He'd once told to go make some tea, now sitting in the seat that used to belong to his boss, holding the single lever that could either bury him or, theoretically, let him breathe. "Margot," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I had no idea you were... I never knew any of this. Please. 10 million is impossible. Please forgive me." He slid out of his chair entirely, kneeling on the carpet, burying his face in his hands, sobbing in a way I'm fairly certain he had never once allowed himself to do in the 15 years I'd known him. I let the silence hold a moment longer before I finally spoke. And when I did, my voice didn't sound anything like the woman who used to apologize for things that weren't her fault. Colin, Margaret, Paige. I let their names sit in the air for a moment, watching each of them flinch in turn. Let's have a long conversation about settling the account for the life you funded on my back for 15 years, and about exactly what your repayment plan for $10 million is going to look like. The curtain, at long last, was coming down on the Ashford family. Please, I'll pay alimony. Anything you want, just make this $10 million disappear. We were married once, Margot, for God's sake. Colin's face was a wreck of tears and desperation as he clung to the edge of the mahogany table, the arrogant man who had once shoved divorce papers across a kitchen island, now reduced to something I hadn't seen from him even once in 15 years of marriage: genuine, unguarded fear. Beside him, still recovering from her fainting spell, Margaret's tone did an abrupt, sickening about-face. That's right, Margot, dear. I always thought of you like a daughter, truly. I was simply led astray by that dreadful girl, Brooke. Please, forgive your mother-in-law. I'm sorry too, Paige chimed in, forcing a trembling, ingratiating smile. Please don't garnish my wages. Please don't take my things. To save themselves, every ounce of pride they'd worn like armor for 15 years evaporated in an instant. This exact scene, 3 people groveling shamelessly the moment their comfort was threatened, was the true character of a family that had spent a decade and a half calling themselves the chosen ones. I met their performance with a calm, unblinking silence. Under that quiet, their voices gradually faded into nothing. I gave a small nod to the attorney standing beside me. Counselor, please walk them through the reality of their situation. Of course, Ms. Ashford. He opened his folder and began reading in the flat, businesslike tone of a man who had delivered bad news for a living for 20 years and had long ago stopped softening it. First, Mr. Ashford, your embezzlement has already been formally indicted as a felony offense. Upon leaving this room, you will be transferred directly into police custody. You will, in all likelihood, serve a multi-year sentence. Prison. Colin's voice came out as barely more than a strangled gasp. Upon your eventual release, since punitive damages of this nature are non-dischargeable in bankruptcy, your debt will continue accruing interest indefinitely. All income beyond a legally mandated minimum for living expenses will be garnished and directed toward repayment. You will also remain under monitoring to prevent any attempt to leave the country. My whole life, Colin muttered, clutching his head. I'll be paying for this my whole life. Next, the guarantors. Richard and Margaret Ashford. Your home and remaining assets have already been listed for sale under the terms of the civil judgment. Your retirement accounts will be garnished to the legal maximum on a monthly basis. You should expect to spend the remainder of your years in considerably reduced housing. I can't live in some hovel? Margaret hissed, though her voice had lost most of its old force. I've only ever shopped at Whole Foods and Neiman Marcus. No one in the room paid her any attention. Paige Ashford, as a listed dependent on several of the accounts under review, you carry outstanding credit obligations of your own from your lifestyle spending. You'll be expected to work off that balance directly. By the time the attorney finished, the full weight of the sentence had settled over all 4 of them. There was no escape route left, no version of events where they simply apologized their way back to comfort. A future of hard labor, humiliation, and lifelong debt now sat ahead of them with total, crushing certainty. You're a monster, Paige spat at me, lunging half out of her chair before one of the security guards gently but firmly pinned her back into it. Are you satisfied? Ruining our lives like this? I rose slowly and crossed the room to stand over them, looking down with a coldness I hadn't known I was capable of until roughly 6 weeks earlier. Ruined your lives, I repeated quietly, and something in my tone made all three of them go still. Don't be mistaken. I didn't ruin anything. Your own vanity did that. Your own greed, your own cruelty, your own willingness to believe you deserved things you never once bothered to earn. I am simply presenting the bill for what you did to me on a cold, rainy night in London when you threw me away, like garbage. I let that sit. Do you have any idea what that felt like? Compared to that, this is still far too generous. Colin had nothing left to offer in response, only more of the same broken, pathetic weeping. By the way, I added, almost conversationally, would you like to know what happened to Brooke? Colin looked up, his eyes glassy and unfocused. She was abandoned by her actual patron the same day the fraud broke. Her pregnancy story fell apart entirely under questioning. She's currently buried under his debts, hiding from collections agents. Last seen somewhere she'd rather not be found. A fitting end, don't you think? Something in Colin finally broke completely. He let out a raw, animal sound of grief, his face twisting in agony as he sobbed, uncontrolled, the full weight of exactly what he'd thrown away, and exactly what he'd traded it for finally landing in full. It's time, one of the attorneys said, glancing at his watch. The heavy doors opened and a pair of uniformed officers entered the room. Colin Ashford. There's a warrant out for your arrest on charges of felony embezzlement and wire fraud. You'll be coming with us. No, please, I don't want to go. Dad, help me. Dad. The officers took him firmly by both arms and led him from the room. Margaret and Paige followed, screaming and sobbing, while Richard, having regained consciousness only to faint again the moment he understood exactly what was happening, was carried out by security. Colin's voice, calling for a father who was no longer answering him, faded down the hallway and eventually disappeared entirely. The heavy doors closed. Silence settled back over the room. That was masterfully handled, Ms. Ashford, Julian said, bowing his head slightly, genuine respect in his voice. The chains of your past are quite officially broken. It's been a long time coming, I said, exhaling slowly, looking out the window at the Chicago skyline glowing gold in the late afternoon light. I felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched tight for 15 years, the last of the dark clouds finally beginning to part. My personal phone chimed with a bright, cheerful ringtone. The moment I saw the name on the screen, the composed, ruthless version of me that had just presided over that entire room quietly stepped aside, and something much warmer took her place. Hi, Mommy. Where are you? I want to see you. Nora's voice, the one treasure in the world I'd been waiting all day to hear, came through clear and bright. She was staying with her sitter at Julian's London flat while I handled the meeting, and considering the time difference, it was well past her bedtime, but she'd clearly stayed up to catch me. I'm sorry, baby. Mommy misses you too. It's all over now. I'm coming home to London tonight. Really? Yay! Can we make omelets when you get back? The good kind. Her cheerful voice brought unexpected tears to my eyes. The omelets Colin and Margaret used to criticize constantly, made by the woman with no skills. My daughter thought they were the best in the world. I couldn't imagine wanting anything more than that in that particular moment. Yes, sweetheart, I'll make you all the omelets you want. After hanging up, I looked back out the window at the sky. The heavy clouds had cleared completely, replaced by an open, brilliant blue. The cage I'd been living inside for 15 years had finally entirely fallen away. There was one call I hadn't made yet, and it was the one I'd been avoiding for 6 weeks. My own parents lived outside Albany, in the same small brick house I'd grown up in, and I hadn't spoken to either of them in almost 3 years. Not because of any single dramatic falling out, but because of the slow, grinding erosion that happens when a controlling husband decides your family isn't the right kind of people, and a tired, worn-down wife stops fighting him on it. Colin had never liked my parents. Too modest, too working class for his taste. My father, a retired high school shop teacher. My mother, a part-time bookkeeper who'd never once pretended to be impressed by Margaret's crystal or Colin's watch collection. Over the years, visits had shrunk from monthly to occasional to, eventually, a stiff phone call around the holidays that Colin would sigh through from the next room until I hung up. I dialed the number from memory, sitting on the edge of my bed in London with the lights off, Nora already asleep down the hall. "Hello?" My mother's voice, older than I remembered, cracked something open in my chest immediately. "Mom, it's Margot." There was a pause so long I thought the call had dropped. "Margot. Oh, honey, we saw the news. Your father's been reading everything he can find for weeks. Are you all right? Is Nora all right?" "We're okay. We're really good, Mom. I should have called weeks ago. I should have called years ago, honestly. You don't have to explain anything to us, sweetheart. We just wanted you to be safe." Her voice wavered. "We tried calling that house so many times over the years. That woman, Colin's mother, she always had some excuse for why you couldn't come to the phone." I sat with that for a long moment, something cold settling in my stomach. I had never known that. I had simply assumed, in the particular fog of those years, that my parents had drifted away on their own, uninterested, too busy with their own lives. "She never told me you called?" "We figured as much, eventually," my mother said quietly. "Your father wanted to drive down there more than once. I talked him out of it. I'm sorry for that now." I told her everything, not the version I'd give a reporter, but the real one. 15 years of small, accumulating erasures, the ghost analyst job I'd kept secret even from her. The divorce, the flight to London, the investigation, the boardroom that afternoon. "A whole secret career," my mother said, and I could hear the disbelief and the pride tangled together in her voice. "Margot, your father is going to want that framed and hung in the living room. He always said you had the sharpest head in the family and nobody ever let you use it." We talked for almost 2 hours. Before we hung up, she asked the question I'd been half dreading and half hoping for. "Can we come see you? Both of us. We'd love to meet our granddaughter properly. Really meet her. Not just birthday cards mailed to an address we were never sure was even the right one." "Yes," I said, and found I was crying in the good way, the way that doesn't hurt on the way out. "Yes. Please come." They flew out 3 weeks later, watching my father, a broad, quiet man who'd spent 30 years teaching teenagers how to use a table saw safely, get down on the living room rug to build an elaborate blanket fort with Nora, both of them collapsing into laughter when it fell in on itself. I felt something in me finally settle that had been unsettled since I was 23 years old, and let a man convince me that my family wasn't good enough for his. "You did good, kid," my father told me quietly, the two of us standing in the kitchen while my mother read Nora a bedtime story upstairs. "I mean that. Not the money, not the big office. All that's nice, sure. I mean, you got yourself and that little girl out. That's the hard part. Everything after that is just details." I hadn't realized, until he said it, how badly I'd needed to hear exactly that from exactly him. The criminal case moved faster than anyone expected, mostly because Colin's public defender, Richard's money having evaporated along with everything else, leaving Colin unable to afford the kind of white-collar defense attorney who might have dragged things out for a year, advised him early on that fighting the charges was pointless, given the sheer weight of the evidence Harrington's team had handed over. 8 weeks after his arrest, Colin pled guilty to felony embezzlement, wire fraud, and falsifying corporate records, in exchange for a sentence that was, in the prosecutor's words, still generous given the scale of the theft. I flew back to Chicago for the sentencing hearing, though not, if I'm honest with myself, entirely out of professional obligation. Some part of me needed to sit in that room and watch the final chapter close with my own eyes. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood-paneled, half empty except for a scattering of reporters in the back rows, and a court sketch artist who kept glancing up at Colin with an expression of mild professional boredom. Richard and Margaret sat 2 rows behind the defense table, Margaret in a plain gray cardigan that looked, I realized with a small jolt, like something she might have criticized me for wearing a year earlier. Paige wasn't there at all. She'd started a second job at a call center that didn't allow personal days, a detail I only learned later from Julian, who'd apparently developed an odd, thorough habit of tracking the family's decline the way some people track stocks. Colin stood when the judge entered, his prison jumpsuit hanging slightly loose on a frame that had clearly lost weight in 8 weeks of pretrial detention. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not just physically. Something in the posture, the particular slump of a man who has run out of angles to work. "Mr. Ashford," the judge said, peering over her glasses at a thick file. "I've reviewed the plea agreement, the victim impact statements, and the financial forensics report prepared by the plaintiff's analyst." Her eyes flicked briefly toward the gallery, toward me, though I doubt anyone but Julian noticed. "I have to say, in 22 years on this bench, I don't see forensic work this clean very often. Whoever prepared it did the prosecution's job for them." A faint, humorless murmur went through the reporter's row. "Mr. Ashford, you occupied a position of significant financial trust at your firm. You used that position to defraud your employer of approximately $4.2 million over a period of 14 months, funneling those funds through a network of shell entities to benefit a co-conspirator who was, according to the evidence before me, actively deceiving you throughout the entire scheme. You have, in effect, managed to be both the perpetrator of a serious financial crime and its most thoroughly humiliated victim, which is not a combination I encounter often." Colin's shoulders sagged further. "Given your cooperation, your guilty plea, and the absence of prior offenses, I'm sentencing you to 7 years in federal custody, followed by 5 years of supervised release. You will additionally be subject to the civil judgment already entered against you, which as I understand it currently stands at $10 million in punitive damages, non-dischargeable, owed to the new ownership of your former employer." "7 years," Colin repeated, barely audible, staring at the defense table. "I'd note for the record," the judge continued, "that the court finds it relevant that the victim of the underlying fraud, your former spouse, whose financial expertise this court understands, was systematically undervalued and concealed during your marriage, is also the individual whose forensic work made this prosecution possible. There's a certain symmetry to that I won't pretend not to notice, Mr. Ashford, even if it isn't strictly a sentencing factor." A bailiff moved toward Colin. Before they let him out, he turned, searching the gallery, and for one brief moment his eyes found mine. I don't know what he was looking for. Forgiveness, maybe, or at least acknowledgement that I'd seen him suffer enough to feel satisfied. I gave him neither. I simply looked back, steady and unmoved, the way you might look at weather passing outside a window, something that no longer had any power to touch you. He was let out through a side door. Margaret made a small, strangled sound and pressed a tissue to her mouth. Richard reached over and took her hand, the first tender gesture I'd seen pass between them in 15 years of knowing this family. Outside the courthouse, a small cluster of reporters caught me on the steps. "Ms. Ashford, any comment on the sentencing?" I stopped, considered the question, and found that I actually did have something to say. Something that had been sitting quietly in my chest for weeks, waiting for the right room to say it in. "For 15 years, I said, I was told by my husband and by his family that I had no skills worth mentioning, that the only thing I contributed to that household was cooking and cleaning, and that I should be grateful for the privilege of doing it. I'd just ask anyone listening to remember that the version of a person you're shown at home isn't always the whole person. Sometimes it's just the part someone decided to let you see. I didn't wait for a follow-up question. I walked to the car Julian had waiting, and by the time we pulled away from the curb, 3 different outlets had already clipped the quote and were running it under headlines with words like vindicated and reckoning. I didn't feel triumphant exactly, watching it circulate on my phone during the flight back to London that evening. I felt something quieter and more permanent than triumph. I felt finished with something, which, it turned out, was even better. I hadn't planned to go looking for her. It was Julian, oddly enough, who brought it up first, sliding a folder across my desk one afternoon a few months after the sentencing with the slightly sheepish air of a man delivering gossip he knows he shouldn't enjoy quite as much as he does. "You don't have to read this," he said, "but I thought you might want to know how it ended." Brooke Sinclair, it turned out, had not landed particularly well. After Victor Calloway threw her out of his apartment that first terrible night, she'd bounced between a series of short-term arrangements, a cousin's couch in Milwaukee, a motel room paid for with the last of a credit card that maxed out within a week, a brief and apparently disastrous stay with a former college roommate who kicked her out after 2 days, for reasons the file didn't specify, but that I could easily imagine. The baby had been born in a county hospital in early spring, a healthy boy, and a DNA test, court-ordered as part of an unrelated paternity dispute that surfaced almost immediately once word got around about who the mother was, confirmed what none of us had been especially surprised to learn. The father wasn't Colin. It wasn't Victor either, whose vasectomy claim had checked out. It was, according to the file, a bartender Brooke had been seeing on and off in the months before she'd ever approached Colin at all. A man who wanted absolutely nothing to do with either her or the baby once the test results came back. She'd tried, briefly, to sell her story to a tabloid, the Mistress who brought down a Wall Street trader, or some similarly lurid framing. But the outlet had done its own fact-checking, discovered the extent of her involvement in Victor's original scheme, and killed the piece rather than risk a defamation suit from Harrington's legal team, who had, apparently, sent a fairly pointed letter the moment they caught wind of it. The last confirmed entry in the file was from a debt collection database. Brooke owed just over $60,000 across 4 different creditors, remnants of the maternity wardrobe, and the lifestyle she'd briefly borrowed while playing the part of Colin's glamorous new future. Her listed address was a shared apartment in a part of Milwaukee the file's author had annotated, rather bluntly, as high turnover. I read the whole thing twice, waiting to feel something. Satisfaction, maybe, or the particular vindictive warmth I might have expected from myself a year earlier. What I actually felt was something closer to a shrug. Brooke had made her choices with her eyes open. She'd looked at a marriage, a child, and a woman's entire 15 years of quiet devotion, and decided all of it was simply an obstacle standing between her and someone else's money. The universe, it seemed, hadn't needed my help settling that particular account. "Do you want me to keep the file open?" Julian asked. "Harrington still gets updates through the civil case, given the restitution order." "No," I said, closing the folder and sliding it back across the desk. "I think I'm done reading about her." I meant it. There is a specific kind of freedom in deciding that someone no longer deserves any more of your attention, even the attention of contempt. I had spent 15 years being defined, in one way or another, by what other people thought of me. I wasn't especially interested in spending the next 15 letting Brooke Sinclair's downfall be the thing that still occupied space in my head. I went home that evening, picked Nora up from Priya's house, and made omelets for dinner, and didn't think about the folder again. Julian had a habit, one I never explicitly asked him to maintain, but never asked him to stop either, of forwarding me the occasional update on the Ashford family's circumstances. I told myself I read them out of due diligence, since I was technically their largest creditor and had every reasonable business interest in tracking their finances. That was mostly true. It wasn't the whole truth, and I knew it. 6 months after the sentencing, the picture that had assembled itself was not a kind one, though I want to be honest and say I didn't spend much time mourning that fact. Margaret and Richard had moved into a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on the far edge of their old suburb, the kind of building neither of them had ever so much as driven past in 30 years of marriage without some comment about property values. Richard, at 64, had taken a part-time position stocking shelves at a hardware store 3 nights a week. The pension he'd spent decades building having been almost entirely absorbed into the restitution payments. Margaret, who had once told a room full of wedding guests that a woman with no particular skills was only good for housework, had found employment as a janitorial staff member at a regional supermarket chain, cleaning the same kind of bathrooms she'd once complained, at length, about the quality of help these days, not scrubbing properly. I'm told, and I take this detail with the appropriate grain of salt, since it arrived secondhand through Julian's contact at the courthouse, that on her first shift, a former country club acquaintance recognized her mid-mop and, rather than offer any sympathy, simply posted about the encounter to a neighborhood social app with more enthusiasm than kindness. Margaret apparently didn't return to that particular supermarket location after that. Paige had it, in some ways, worse. She was 29, with an associate's degree she'd never finished putting to use, no savings of her own beyond what she'd spent, and a stack of credit card debt from a decade of designer bags and international vacations that the restitution order didn't touch at all, since it had been entirely her own. She was working 2 jobs, a call center by day, a big box retail overnight shift on weekends, and had, according to the file, moved back into her parents' one-bedroom apartment, sleeping on a pull-out couch that put her, at 29 years old, roughly 18 inches from where her mother snored. None of it was cruelty on my part. I want to be clear about that, mostly to myself, since I've turned the question over more than a few times in the quiet hours after Nora's gone to bed. I hadn't personally engineered a single one of those consequences beyond the initial forensic report and the acquisition itself. The restitution schedule was standard. The asset seizure was standard. The judge's sentence had been, by her own account, generous given the scale of the fraud. Every single domino that fell after that first push had fallen because of choices Colin, Margaret, Richard, and Paige had each made entirely on their own, over years, long before I'd ever picked up a phone and called Julian Pierce's employer. What I had done, the only thing I had actually done, was stop absorbing the consequences of their choices on their behalf. For 15 years, I had quietly caught every dropped plate, smoothed over every humiliation, made myself smaller so the rest of them could stay comfortable. The moment I stopped doing that, the weight simply landed where it had always belonged. It just happened to land all at once, and it happened to land somewhere everyone could see it. I read the updates. I felt most days very little. Not joy, not regret. Something closer to the flat, distant interest you might have in a news story about a city you used to live in but don't especially miss. The one exception was Colin's letters. He'd started writing to me from prison about 4 months in short, cramped, apologetic notes that arrived at the London office rather than the house, since he had no way of knowing my home address, and Julian's team had made sure it stayed that way. I read the first one out of morbid curiosity. It was full of the particular, performative remorse of a man who has finally run out of other people to blame, though I noticed he still managed, in a 4-paragraph letter, to mention twice how unfair certain aspects of the sentence felt. I didn't answer. I didn't answer the second one either, or the third, or the 6 that followed after that. Eventually they stopped arriving, and I felt, when I noticed the gap, something closer to peace than to guilt. Nora asked about her father exactly twice in that entire first year. The first time was a simple, matter-of-fact question over breakfast. "Is Daddy still in trouble?" That I answered honestly and gently, in the smallest possible words, the way a child psychologist Julian had connected me with, had coached me to. The second time was months later, unprompted, apropos of nothing, while we were building a puzzle on the living room floor. "I don't miss him," she said, not looking up from the puzzle piece in her hand. "Is that bad?" "No, sweetheart," I told her, and meant it completely. "It's not bad at all. It just means you know what you deserve." A year is a strange unit of measurement when your entire life has been rearranged inside of it. Some days it felt like I'd lived in London my whole life, the tube map memorized down to the transfer stations, Nora's school run so automatic I could have done it half asleep. Other days, usually triggered by something small and stupid. A certain slant of gray afternoon light, the smell of a particular hand soap. I'd feel the whole weight of the old life rush back in for a few seconds before I remembered, with real relief, that I didn't live there anymore. Ashford Sterling Capital, rebranded 6 months into my tenure, as Meridian Sterling Partners, a name Edmund and I chose together over a bottle of wine one evening specifically because it had absolutely nothing to do with anyone's surname, had, against most analysts' early predictions, stabilized faster than anyone expected. I'd spent my first 90 days doing something almost nobody in that building had anticipated. I didn't gut the place. I fired exactly 4 people, all of them senior leaders who'd either known about Colin's fraud and looked away, or had actively benefited from the same culture of image over substance that had let him rise as fast as he had. Everyone else, the analysts, the associates, the mid-level people who'd shown up every day and done honest work while the men above them played golf and skimmed, I kept, and in several cases, promoted. "You could have cleaned house completely," Edmund said to me once, reviewing the first-year numbers with visible satisfaction. "Most people in your position would have. Most people in my position spent 15 years being told they didn't understand how business worked," I said. "I understand it better than most, actually, because I spent a decade and a half watching how badly it can go wrong when the people at the top only reward flattery and appearances." By the 18-month mark, Meridian Sterling had recovered nearly 90% of its lost client base and picked up a considerable amount of new business specifically from firms who wanted to be associated, publicly, with a company that had cleaned house so thoroughly and so publicly after its founder's fraud. There is, it turns out, real market value in visible integrity. Something Colin, in 15 years of chasing status, had never once understood. I found, to my own surprise, that I loved the work in a way that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong anymore. In the early months, I'd have been lying if I said some part of every decision wasn't at least partially fueled by the memory of Margaret's voice telling me I had no particular skills. But somewhere around the 1-year mark, that fuel quietly ran out, replaced by something more sustainable. Genuine interest, genuine pride. The simple, uncomplicated satisfaction of being extremely good at something and finally being allowed to say so out loud. Julian and I became, over that year, something like real friends, in the specific way that surviving a chaotic professional crisis together tends to accelerate a friendship. He had a dry, understated sense of humor that took me months to fully appreciate, and an endless patience for Nora, who had taken to calling him Mr. Pierce with the good umbrellas after the night he'd rescued us both from the rain, a nickname he pretended to find exhausting and clearly loved. There was, if I'm being fully honest in the retelling of this, a period around month 14 where I wondered whether something more than friendship might be developing between us. A lingering glance after a late meeting, A dinner that ran a little longer than strictly necessary. Julian, to his enormous credit, was the one who eventually named it out loud, over coffee on a gray Tuesday, with the same calm directness he brought to everything else. "I think I should say, plainly, that I've become rather fond of you," he said. "And I think I should also say, equally plainly, that I have no intention of acting on that unless you're certain it's something you actually want, and not simply something that feels safe because I happen to be standing in the rain on the worst night of your life." I laughed, more from relief than amusement, because it was exactly the question I'd been quietly asking myself. "I don't know yet," I told him honestly. "I spent 15 years building my whole identity around a man's approval. I think I need a while longer building one around just mine." "That," he said, "is precisely the correct answer, and I'll be here in whatever form you eventually decide you want me in." We left it there, comfortably, and if I'm honest, that conversation did more to steady me than almost anything else that entire year. The simple, novel experience of a man offering me something without a single condition attached to it, and being completely fine when I didn't take it immediately. Nora, for her part, was thriving in a way that still occasionally caught me off guard. The anxious, careful little girl who used to flinch at raised voices and apologize reflexively for taking up space had been replaced, gradually and then all at once, by a genuinely loud, opinionated 7-year-old who argued with me about bedtime with the confidence of a much older child and had, according to her teacher, appointed herself the unofficial mediator of every playground dispute in her class. "She has excellent instincts for fairness," her teacher told me at a parent conference, smiling. "Very clear about what's right and what isn't. Doesn't back down easily once she's decided." I sat in that little plastic chair meant for someone half my size and thought, with a lump rising in my throat that I had to work hard to swallow, that I had never once been allowed to be that person at 7 years old, and that watching my daughter get to be exactly that was very possibly the single greatest accomplishment of my entire life. Prison sentences and corporate acquisitions included. I should have known Colin wouldn't simply accept 7 years and a $10 million debt without at least one more attempt to claw his way out from under it. 17 months into his sentence, his newly retained appellate attorney, paid for, I later learned, by a small GoFundMe campaign Paige had quietly set up under a fake name, which had raised a grand total of $1,100 from what appeared to be mostly strangers who'd found the story entertaining rather than sympathetic, filed a motion arguing that the forensic report underlying his conviction had been compiled by a party with an undisclosed personal conflict of interest. Me. The argument, laid out across 60 pages of increasingly desperate legal reasoning, was that as Colin's ex-wife, I had a demonstrable personal motive to fabricate or exaggerate evidence against him, and that the report should never have been admitted without a fully independent third-party audit. Harrington's legal team called me the morning the motion was filed, and I remember sitting very still at my desk, watching the London rain streak down the window, waiting to feel something like panic. What I actually felt was something closer to mild, almost clinical curiosity about how far he thought this would actually get him. "It won't succeed," the lead attorney told me over the phone, not bothering to hide his irritation at having to spend billable hours on what he clearly considered a nuisance filing. "The forensic methodology has already been independently verified twice, once by the SEC's own investigators during the original case, and again during the civil proceeding. This is a Hail Mary from a man with nothing left to lose." He was right. The motion was denied within 6 weeks, the judge's written response noting, with what I found to be a satisfying amount of dryness, that The fact that Ms. Ashford's professional expertise happened to expose her former husband's crimes does not, on its own, constitute evidence of fabrication, particularly where every underlying data point has since been independently confirmed by federal investigators with no personal connection to either party whatsoever. Still, the 6 weeks between the filing and the denial were not entirely comfortable ones. It meant sitting through a deposition, my own testimony, taken by video link from a conference room in London, walking a room full of lawyers through 15 years of quiet, secret work, with the same clinical precision I'd have used for any client report. It meant answering questions about my marriage that I'd have preferred never to answer out loud, delivered by an appellate attorney clearly hoping I'd crack, get emotional, say something that could be spun into evidence of vindictive intent. I didn't crack. I answered every single question with the same flat, factual calm I'd used in that first boardroom, and by the end of 3 hours, the attorney taking my deposition looked considerably more exhausted than I felt. "You're very composed for someone discussing the collapse of her marriage," he said at one point, somewhere between a compliment and an accusation. "I had 15 years to prepare for this conversation," I told him. "You've had about 90 minutes. The motion died. Colin's sentence stood. And if I'm honest, the entire ordeal did something useful for me that I hadn't expected. It forced me to say the whole story out loud, methodically, under oath, in a way that stripped it of every last bit of shame I'd apparently still been quietly carrying around without fully realizing it. By the time I hung up that video call, I felt lighter than I had in months. The way you feel after finally lancing something that had been quietly infected for far too long." I told Julian about it that evening, over the dinner he'd started semi-regularly joining us for, an arrangement that had settled into something comfortable and unhurried, exactly the pace I'd needed it to move at. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said. "Don't be," I told him, and meant it. It turns out there's a version of closure you only get by saying the whole thing out loud to someone whose entire job is trying to poke holes in it. I feel better than I have in a year. Nora, oblivious to the legal drama unfolding an ocean away, spent that particular dinner attempting to teach Julian the rules of a card game she'd apparently invented herself, with rules that changed, suspiciously, every time she was about to lose. "I don't think that's a real rule, Nora," Julian said, laughing, as she triumphantly declared herself the winner for the 3rd consecutive round. "It's real now," she said, with the absolute unshakable confidence of a 7-year-old who had never once been taught to make herself smaller for anyone else's comfort. And watching her, I thought that whatever else that entire ordeal had cost me, it had bought my daughter something I would have paid twice the price for. A little over 2 years after I'd stood shivering on that London sidewalk, a financial magazine with a fairly wide circulation reached out asking to profile me for a series on women who'd rebuilt careers after major life disruptions. I almost said no. Some part of me still recoiled from the idea of turning 15 years of quiet suffering into a tidy magazine narrative with a flattering headshot and a pull quote in bold font. Edmund was the one who eventually talked me into it, in his usual understated way. "You don't owe anyone your story," he said, "but I'd remind you that somewhere out there is a woman exactly where you were 2 years ago, sitting in a kitchen being told she has no skills worth mentioning, who has absolutely no idea that a different life is possible on the other side of that. You might be the only person who could actually make her believe it." I agreed to the interview on the condition that Nora's name and school stayed out of it entirely, and that the piece focus on the actual mechanics of what I'd built, the analysis, the acquisition, the turnaround at Meridian Sterling, rather than turning Colin's downfall into cheap entertainment. The journalist, to her credit, honored both conditions. The piece ran under the headline, "The Housewife Who Was Secretly One of the Sharpest Minds in Finance, and What Happened When Everyone Found Out," which was slightly more dramatic than I'd have chosen myself, but not, strictly speaking, inaccurate. It detailed the 15 years as a ghost analyst, the acquisition, the restructuring at Meridian Sterling, and closed with a quote I'd given somewhat spontaneously near the end of a 2-hour conversation that had, by that point, started to feel less like an interview and more like therapy. I spent a decade and a half being told that my only value was in how well I could disappear into someone else's life. The quote read, "What I'd tell any woman in that position now is that the skills that get dismissed at home are very often the exact skills that will save you once you finally get the chance to use them somewhere they're actually valued. Don't let anyone convince you that quiet means small." The response surprised me. Within a week, my inbox at Meridian Sterling had several hundred messages from women I'd never met. Some of them brief and grateful, some of them long and detailed, describing their own versions of the same story. The slow erasure, the financial dependence used as a leash, the particular cruelty of being told your unpaid labor doesn't count as a skill. I couldn't answer all of them, but I read every single one, usually late at night after Nora had gone to bed, and I found myself gradually unable to simply file the experience away as a nice piece of press coverage. 6 months later, working with a small nonprofit Edmonds firm already quietly funded, I helped launch a modest fellowship program specifically for women re-entering finance and other analytical fields after years spent out of the workforce raising children or managing a household. Women exactly like the one I'd been for 15 years, whose resumes had a gap that employers routinely read as a deficiency rather than what it actually was, an entirely different, equally demanding kind of full-time labor. The first cohort was 6 women. By the time the program reached its second year, we had over 40 applicants for 8 spots, and I'd started spending one Saturday a month doing informal mentoring calls, walking women through the specific practical mechanics of rebuilding a professional identity from something close to zero. Not because I thought my story was universally applicable, but because I understood, more precisely than almost anyone I could think of, exactly which particular doubts needed talking through first. "You keep telling me I'm qualified," one woman told me on an early call, her voice tight with the particular anxiety of someone who has been told the opposite for a very long time. "But what if I try, and it turns out my husband was right?" I recognized the question immediately because I'd asked myself some version of it on that plane to London, staring at my own reflection in the dark window. "Then you'll have tried," I told her. "And you'll know finally, instead of just wondering. I promise you, not knowing is so much worse than finding out the hard way. I did it the hard way. I'd still recommend it over never finding out at all." She got the job, eventually, a research associate position at a mid-size fund in Boston, considerably smaller than Meridian Sterling, but, by every account, the first thing in a decade that belonged entirely and unambiguously to her. She sent me a photograph of her first paycheck stub, framed, sitting on her new desk, with a note that simply said, "Thank you for making me try the hard way." I kept that email. I still have it, actually, pinned to the top of a folder I don't often open but like knowing is there. By the 3rd anniversary of the night I signed those divorce papers, the details of the Ashford family's decline had become less something I actively tracked, and more something that simply drifted into my awareness now and then, the way you hear news about acquaintances from a life you've mostly moved past. Colin, according to the last update Julian passed along, had become something of a cautionary tale inside the facility where he was serving his sentence. A man who, according to a corrections officer's note in his file, still occasionally introduced himself to new inmates as an elite. Actually, this was all a misunderstanding. A habit that had earned him more mockery than sympathy from men serving considerably harder time for considerably less privileged reasons. He worked in the prison's small furniture workshop, earning a wage that amounted to a few dollars a day, every cent of which was garnished toward his restitution the moment it hit his account. At the rate the math worked out, even accounting for the additional labor income once he was eventually released, he'd likely still be paying down the $10 million into his 70s. Richard had passed away 18 months into Colin's sentence. A heart attack. Sudden. At the hardware store where he'd been stocking shelves 3 nights a week. I felt something unexpected when Julian told me. A small, genuine pang of sadness that surprised me, given everything. Richard had been a weak man, a man who'd let his wife and son run roughshod over both his own opinions and my dignity for 15 years, without once intervening in any meaningful way. But he had also, in the end, been the one person in that family who'd found something like real remorse, who had, in that interrogation room, told his own son the truth about what he'd thrown away, tears on his face, before walking out and never speaking to him again. I sent a card to Margaret, brief and formal, and never received a reply, which didn't surprise me and didn't especially bother me either. Margaret, alone now in the one-bedroom apartment above the laundromat, had developed, according to the file, a fairly serious health condition connected to years of standing on hard supermarket floors, with knees that had never fully recovered from a hip replacement she'd had in her 50s. She'd applied for disability twice and been denied both times. Paige had moved out of the shared apartment eventually, into a studio of her own, still working 2 jobs, still paying down her own debt, though the most recent note in the file mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd started taking night classes toward a bookkeeping certification. The first genuinely productive decision I'd heard about from anyone in that family in 3 years. I read that particular detail twice. Paige had been cruel to me, casually and repeatedly, in ways that still occasionally surfaced in memory at inconvenient moments. But there was something in the image of her, 29 years old, sitting in a community college classroom after 2 exhausting shifts, trying to build something real for herself out of the wreckage her family had left behind, that I found I couldn't entirely resent. People do occasionally learn something from the worst thing that ever happened to them. I would know. Brooke had, by the most recent and least reliable report Julian's contact could dig up, moved to a different state entirely, working retail under a name that wasn't quite her legal one, her son. The one whose paternity had never been resolved with any real certainty beyond ruling out both Colin and Victor. Being raised, as far as anyone could tell, mostly by her own mother while Brooke worked double shifts to keep up with the debt Victor had left her holding. None of it was joy, reading through those updates. It was something quieter and, I think, healthier than joy. The simple, settled recognition that the story had ended the way stories about cruelty and vanity tend to end, eventually, if you're patient enough to wait for it. I hadn't needed to engineer any of the specific suffering. I'd only needed to stop protecting them from the consequences they'd spent years building for themselves, brick by careless brick. I closed the file that evening and didn't open another one for almost a year. Nora was 9 when her school assigned a family tree project, construction paper, glue sticks, a assignment sheet asking each child to fill in 2 full generations, photographs encouraged. She brought it home in her backpack on a Wednesday and spread it across the kitchen table with the particular seriousness she brought to every school assignment, markers lined up by color. "I need pictures of Dad's side too," she said, matter of fact, not looking up from the branch she was carefully labeling. "Grandma Margaret and Grandpa Richard. Do we have any?" I stood very still at the counter for a moment, a knife halfway through an onion, caught off guard by a question I probably should have anticipated years earlier and somehow hadn't. "We might have a few old ones packed away," I said carefully. "Can I ask why you want those specifically?" She looked up at me with the direct, unblinking honesty that had never once left her, even at 9. "Because they're still my grandparents. Even if what they did was bad. Miss Ferris said the tree is about who you're related to, not who you like. I set the knife down and sat across from her at the table. That's a really wise way to think about it, sweetheart. Can I tell you something about your dad's family, though? Something I think you're old enough to hear now? She nodded, setting her marker down, giving me the full weight of her attention. I told her, in language calibrated for a 9-year-old but not sanitized past honesty, roughly what had happened. Not every detail. She didn't need the specifics of the embezzlement or Brooke's fabricated pregnancy, but the shape of it. That her father and his family had treated me unkindly for a long time, that they'd valued things like money and appearances more than they valued being good to people, and that some of the hard choices they'd made had eventually caught up with them in serious ways. Is that why we don't see them? That's part of it, yes. She was quiet for a moment, turning a green marker over in her fingers. I'm glad you took me away that night, she said finally. I don't really remember most of it, but I remember you were brave. Priya's mum says you're basically a superhero, actually, but don't tell her I told you that. She'll be embarrassed. I laughed, mostly to keep from crying in front of her, and pulled her into a hug over the half-finished construction paper tree. We ended up including Richard and Margaret on the tree after all. Small photographs from an old holiday card I'd kept, half out of nostalgia and half out of a sense of accuracy I couldn't fully explain even to myself. Nora presented the project 2 weeks later and, according to a note her teacher sent home, gave a small, unprompted speech to her classmates about how families are complicated, and it's okay for some branches to be sad ones as long as the tree keeps growing new leaves anyway. I framed that teacher's note. It's still on my desk at Meridian Sterling, next to the framed email from the woman in Boston with her first paycheck. 2 very different pieces of evidence pointing toward the exact same conclusion. That the things I'd spent 15 years being told didn't matter had in fact mattered enormously all along to exactly the people who counted most. Julian never brought up that conversation from month 14 again, not directly, not in the 2 years that followed it. He simply kept showing up. Dinners that became a regular Thursday fixture, weekend trips to see Nora's football matches when work allowed, an easy, undemanding presence that asked nothing of me beyond what I already wanted to give. I found, somewhere around Nora's 9th birthday, that I'd stopped thinking of him as Julian, who I might someday feel something for, and started simply thinking of him as a fixed, comfortable point in both of our lives. The way you stop noticing a piece of furniture has always been exactly where it is, because it fits so naturally into the room. It was Nora, in the end, who forced the conversation into the open, with the blunt, unfiltered directness that seemed to be her signature trait by that point. Are you and Mr. Pierce with the good umbrellas ever going to just be together? Or is this a whole thing you're both doing on purpose? She asked one evening, apropos of nothing, while the 3 of us were washing dishes after dinner. Julian nearly dropped a plate. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. Nora Ashford, I said, once I could speak again. That is an extremely direct question for a 9-year-old. You always tell me directness is a strength, she said, entirely unbothered, drying a bowl with the same seriousness she brought to everything. I looked at Julian across the kitchen, and something in his expression, patient, warm, entirely without pressure, made the whole decision feel suddenly, uncomplicatedly simple in a way it hadn't quite managed to feel in 2 years of careful, deliberate distance. I think, I said slowly, your mother has spent a very long time making sure every decision she makes belongs entirely to her and not to anyone else's timeline, and I think she's finally ready to make this one. Is that a yes? Nora demanded, looking between the 2 of us with the impatience of a child who has just watched 2 adults take an unnecessarily long route to an obvious conclusion. That's a yes, I said, and Julian's smile, when it landed, was the kind of smile that made the entire slow, careful, 2-year wait feel exactly as worthwhile as it had been. We didn't rush anything after that either. No dramatic proposal, no sudden merging of households. Julian kept his own flat a 15-minute walk from ours for another full year, and we built the relationship the same deliberate, unhurried way I'd rebuilt everything else in my life since that rainy London sidewalk. Carefully, on my own terms, at a pace that never once asked me to shrink myself to fit someone else's comfort. When he finally did move in, 18 months later, Nora's only condition was that he learn the actual, correct rules of her card game, the real ones, not the ones she'd been making up as she went for 3 straight years. "I've been letting you win this entire time," she informed him solemnly, dealing out a new hand at the kitchen table. "But you're family now, so you get to actually learn." Julian looked at me over the top of her head, delighted and slightly stunned, and I thought, watching the two of them argue amiably over a rule Nora was very obviously still inventing in real time, that this exact, unremarkable, ordinary evening was worth more than every dollar of the 10 million I'd never once actually needed for myself. 5 years after I signed those divorce papers in a kitchen I never wanted to see again, I stood at the window of my office on a Friday evening, watching the last of a heavy spring rain clear off the Thames, the clouds pulling apart to reveal a wide gold sky behind them. Nora, 11 now, sat cross-legged on the office sofa doing homework, having long since graduated from the sitter arrangement to simply coming straight to my office after school on the days Julian had late meetings of his own. "Mum, look," she said, pointing out the window. A rainbow had appeared over the river, wide and unusually vivid, arching from somewhere near the tower down toward the financial district where I'd rebuilt my entire life from the wreckage of the old one. I stood there for a long moment, letting myself actually feel the full weight of the 5 years that had passed since that first rainy night on a London sidewalk, a shivering child in my arms, no idea in the world what waited for either of us. I thought about the woman I'd been in that kitchen, signing her name to a divorce agreement while her mother-in-law told her she was worthless. I thought about Richard's voice on that first phone call, insisting a woman with no skills couldn't possibly raise a child alone. I thought about Paige at the airport, certain I'd come crawling back within a month, broke and humbled. None of them had been able to see what I actually was, because none of them had ever once bothered to look past the version of me that was convenient for them. Quiet, compliant, endlessly absorbing whatever they needed absorbed so their own lives could stay comfortable. It had taken losing everything they thought they controlled about me to finally show them the whole picture. And by then, of course, it was far too late for that knowledge to do them any good at all. I don't say any of this with lingering anger anymore. That particular fire burned itself out somewhere around year 3, replaced by something calmer and, I think, more useful. A settled, unshakable certainty about my own worth that no one would ever again be able to talk me out of, not with insults, not with financial control, not with 15 years of carefully applied erosion. If there's a version of this story that matters beyond my own particular details, beyond Colin, beyond Margaret, beyond a London rainstorm and a boardroom reveal that felt, at the time, like the most satisfying moment of my entire life, I think it's this: the value other people assign you, especially people who benefit from underestimating you, is not the same thing as your actual value. It never was. I spent 15 years believing a lie that a handful of cruel, small-minded people told me on repeat until I mistook their repetition for truth. The lie didn't become less of a lie just because I believed it. It just meant I wasted 15 years I could have spent living as the person I actually was the entire time. If there's anyone reading or hearing this who recognizes some version of that kitchen, That voice telling you you're nothing without them, that particular, specific exhaustion of making yourself smaller so someone else can stay comfortable. I want you to hear this clearly, from someone who has now stood on both sides of that particular door. Your life is your own. It was never anyone else's to manage, dismiss, or take credit for. You do not need anyone else's permission to discover what you're actually capable of. Sometimes all it takes is one door, opened at the worst possible moment, on the worst possible night, when you finally decide that whatever's on the other side has to be better than what you're leaving behind. Mum, are you crying? Nora asked, looking up from her homework with the same direct, searching expression she'd had since she was 6 years old on that airport bench, already more aware of the world around her than anyone gave her credit for. No, sweetheart, I said, wiping my eyes and giving her the biggest, most honest smile I had in me. I'm just thinking about how happy I am. Right now, in this exact moment, I think I might be the happiest person in the world. Me too, she said, grinning, closing her math workbook with the satisfied finality of a kid who's decided she's done enough homework for one evening. Can we get chips on the way home? Julian said he'd make his terrible pasta tonight and I want a backup plan. I laughed, pulled her into a hug, and looked back out at the rainbow one more time before we gathered our things and headed for the door. Whatever came next, I knew I would never again let anyone convince me I had to shrink myself to survive it. I had already done the hardest part, walked through a door in the pouring rain with nothing but a suitcase and my daughter's hand in mine, with no certainty at all about what waited on the other side. Everything since had simply been the process of finding out exactly how much I'd been capable of the entire time, and building, patiently and on my own terms, a life that finally had enough room in it for the whole of who I actually was. We took the elevator down together, stepped out into the cool, rain-washed evening air, and walked home along the river, my daughter's hand in mine, the last of the light catching gold on the water, a rainbow fading slowly behind us over a city that had given me, against every expectation I walked into it with, exactly the life I deserved. People sometimes ask me, usually at the tail end of one of those mentoring calls, whether I ever feel guilty about how thoroughly things collapsed for Colin's family. It's a fair question, and I've turned it over enough times now that I have an actual answer instead of just a defensive reflex. I don't feel guilty. I've looked for the guilt, honestly, in the quiet moments when it would be easiest to find if it were there. Watching Nora sleep, sitting alone on a late flight home from a client meeting, the particular vulnerable hour just before falling asleep myself. It simply isn't there, and I've stopped expecting it to show up. What I feel instead, if I'm being precise about it, is something closer to clarity. For 15 years, I absorbed the consequences of other people's cruelty and mismanagement so thoroughly that I genuinely lost track of where their choices ended and my own responsibilities began. Colin's affair wasn't my failure to be a better wife. Margaret's cruelty wasn't a bill I owed for having a daughter instead of a son. Colin's embezzlement wasn't a debt my quiet compliance was supposed to keep absorbing indefinitely. Once I stopped catching every falling object on their behalf, the objects simply fell where gravity had always intended them to land. I didn't push anyone. I only, finally, stepped out of the way. I think about the version of myself in that kitchen sometimes, signing my name to a document that was supposed to mark the end of something, though it turned out to mark the beginning of something else entirely. I think about how certain I was, in that exact moment, that I was walking into total uncertainty with nothing but a suitcase and a 6-year-old's hand in mine. In a sense, I was right. I had no idea, standing at that departure's gate, that a black car would appear out of the rain within 24 hours and change the entire shape of what came next. But I've come to believe, in the years since, that the car wasn't actually the turning point. The turning point was earlier than that. It was the 15 years before it. All the quiet, unglamorous, unrewarded work I did in the margins of a life that had no room left over for me. It was every late night at that laptop in the closet, every report I finished after everyone else in the house was asleep, every ounce of expertise I kept sharp and current on my own time, for no audience, expecting no credit, simply because it was mine, and I refused to let it atrophy completely even when every voice around me insisted it didn't matter. The car in the rain didn't make me capable. It simply arrived at the exact moment I finally had somewhere safe to prove it. Nora is 12 now, taller than I expected her to be this early, opinionated in exactly the way I hoped she'd grow up to be. Utterly unbothered by voices that try to tell her what she's allowed to want for herself. She doesn't remember much about the man in that kitchen anymore, and on the days that fact makes me sad on her behalf, I remind myself that it's also, in its own way, a kind of mercy. An entire category of pain she simply never had to carry the way I did. Meridian Sterling posted its strongest quarter yet last month. The fellowship program has placed 31 women in new positions over 4 cohorts, several of whom I still hear from regularly, their emails arriving at odd hours full of the specific, hard-won confidence of people who spent years being told they had nothing to offer and finally found somewhere that disagreed. Julian is, somehow, still exactly as patient and unhurried as he was on that first rainy night, though he's gotten considerably worse at cards, ever since Nora finally taught him the real rules. I don't know exactly what the next 5 years hold. I've learned not to need that certainty the way I once thought I did. What I know is this. I am the same woman who used to iron a collar 4 separate times because it still wasn't quite right, who used to rehearse dinner conversation topics in the car so I wouldn't say the wrong thing at the table, who used to believe, on the worst nights, that maybe I really was as unremarkable as I kept being told. And I am also, entirely and without contradiction, the woman who tore apart a 15-year lie with nothing but a laptop and 15 years of quiet, uncredited expertise, and built something better out of the wreckage than anyone standing in that kitchen ever thought I had in me. Both of those women are me. I'm not interested in pretending the first one wasn't real, or that she was somehow weak for staying as long as she did. She was surviving the only way she knew how, with the information and the options she had at the time. But I am considerably more interested these days in being the second one, the woman who finally believed, all the way down, that quiet was never the same thing as small, and that a door, once you're brave enough to walk through it, tends to open onto far more than you ever gave yourself credit for imagining. I've told versions of this story a handful of times now, to the magazine writer, to the women in my fellowship program, to Nora in careful, age-appropriate pieces as she's grown old enough to hold each new layer of it. Every time someone asks me some variation of the same question, how did you know? How did you know, sitting in that kitchen with divorce papers in front of you and no idea what waited on the other side of that door, that leaving was actually going to work out? The honest answer is that I didn't know. Not really. I had a plan, and I had 15 years of quietly built expertise that I hoped, desperately, would eventually count for something. But I had no guarantee. I had no crystal ball telling me a black car would pull up out of the rain, no certainty that Edmund would still want me, no promise that the investigation into Colin's fraud would turn up anything at all, let alone something as thorough as it did. For all I knew, standing at that departure's gate with Nora's hand in mine, I might have landed in London and simply struggled, genuinely struggled, the way Paige so gleefully predicted I would, broke and exhausted and alone in a foreign city with a 6-year-old depending on me for everything. I want to be honest about that, because I think the version of this story that only works if you already know it has a happy ending isn't actually useful to anyone standing where I was standing that night. What I did know, with total certainty, wasn't that things would work out. It was simply that staying wasn't survivable anymore. Not for me, and more importantly, not for the small, watchful person standing beside me in that kitchen, absorbing every lesson about what love was supposed to look like from the only example she had. Sometimes the door you walk through isn't a door toward certainty. Sometimes it's just a door away from something you already know, with total clarity, that you cannot keep surviving. That was enough. It had to be enough. Because it was all I had. I think about Margaret sometimes. Oddly enough, more than I think about Colin. Not with anger anymore. That particular fire has been out for years. I think about her instead with something closer to a strange, distant pity, because I've come to understand something about her that I don't think she's ever once understood about herself. Margaret spent her entire adult life building her worth out of things that could be taken away in an instant: money, status, a son's success, a daughter-in-law she could look down on to feel superior. Every single one of those foundations turned out to be exactly as fragile as they were, because none of them ever actually belonged to her. They were borrowed, contingent, entirely dependent on circumstances staying exactly as favorable as they happened to be in that particular moment. I built something different in the end, without fully realizing that's what I was doing until it was already done. I built my worth out of something no one could repossess, freeze, garnish, or take away in a single furious phone call. A set of skills, sharpened quietly over 15 years in a closet nobody bothered to check. That turned out to be entirely, unshakably mine the whole time. Nobody gave that to me. Nobody could take it away either, no matter how many divorce papers they slid across a kitchen island, no matter how many credit cards they canceled out of spite on a rainy London night. That's the part I actually want people to take from this, more than the satisfaction of watching a cruel family finally answer for what they'd done. Build the thing nobody can take from you. Keep it sharp, even in the years when no one around you seems to think it matters. Especially in those years, honestly, because those are exactly the years it's quietly becoming the thing that eventually sets you free. Nora asked me recently, doing homework at the kitchen table while I made dinner, what the most important thing I'd learned in the last 5 years actually was. I thought about it longer than the question probably warranted, turning over boardrooms and courtroom sentencing hearings and a rainbow over the Thames, before I finally landed on the answer that felt truest. That being underestimated isn't the same thing as being small, I told her. Sometimes it just means the people underestimating you haven't been paying attention. And someday, sweetheart, that's going to work entirely in your favor, the same way it eventually did in mine. She nodded, wrote something down in the margin of her math homework that I didn't ask to see, and went back to her fractions, entirely unbothered, exactly the way a 12-year-old should be allowed to be: free, curious, and never once required to make herself smaller for anyone else's comfort. That, in the end, was always the whole point.